This is Gabe Matthews for Polyplane.com. We're continuing on with our Intro to Rendering series, and today we're going to discuss the objects in the scene. As I mentioned in the first video in this series, objects are what indicate the form and shadows, and sometimes, depending on the material that is applied, can also be another source of illumination in your render. Here's where it gets a little hairy though. Polyplane largely to this point is focused on NURBS as the modeling medium in 3D space. You remember from the video Mesh versus NURBS, I talk about the differences between the two as far as surface resolution and scale. This goes out the window when rendering because the computer is going to mesh whatever you're modeling for display purposes in the render, so think about what your intent is when you're modeling. There's a silver lining in a lot of programs though. You can change up the surface resolution via subdivision if you're still working with a parametric object. This will ultimately save you some time and some rendering horsepower on the back end. Let's look at this from the 1,000-foot view just for a moment. If you have two forms in space and they're staggered in space, so one's closer to the camera and one's further back in space, the one that's closer to the camera is obviously going to show you more detail, assuming you have detail to show, such as surface texture, shut lining, etc. The one in the background is going to be less detailed, obviously. Set up a couple objects on your desk. Now focus your eye on the one that is closest to you. Your brain knows what the objects are, so it's going to fill in the details for you. This same principle works perfectly in a rendering if you do a few things. A. Inform the viewer of what they are looking at. B. Repeat the form in the background if needed. The foreground element will inform what the background object is if they're the same thing. If they are a common item like a wallet, a knife, or other objects that are commonplace, the brain takes what it knows and will inform the eye of what the backgrounds are. It'll connect the dots. And in C, you can change the subdivisions of the objects depending on if it's closer or further away from the camera. This can be achieved with relative ease in programs such as Cinema 4D, but in programs like Rhino where rendering plays second fiddle to modeling and execution of a model for production, you'll be working with a global scale, so changing your mesh settings in the document properties acts on a global scale rather than per object. In this case, your computer will chug along relative to all the meshes at once versus independently. Regarding foreground and background objects, let's look at a couple of examples. In this rendering of a ring, it has multiple parts, but by reading the foreground element of the ring, you can make assumptions about how the rest of the form is laid out. The brain loves patterns, but what happens if the form isn't clear? In this case, the ring is a little more nebulous. Here, it's harder to decipher what is happening. This is partially a problem of material selection for the ring, as the reflections are giving inconsistent information to the eye, but also that the angle of the ring for this rendering is too close in and could afford to be tilted to the side a little more so you can see that it's one common element that's making up the ring. The point being that the more simple you keep your renderings as far as material selection and camera angles, the easier it's going to be for the person looking at them to understand what it is they're looking at. If I haven't told you these were rings, you would have probably thought they were some sort of abstract sculpture or some crazy vehicle, so putting things in context is key. Context can be given to your form by putting it in a place where it has scale. Aside from this controller being a common everyday object, the fact that I've composited it into a space where there's a pen and some keys and a notebook and some other elements on the desk, it assists the viewer in understanding the scale. This can also be achieved by putting a person in your renderings, as this rendering shows. So just a few things I wanted to talk about regarding objects before we move on. Next, we're going to be talking about materials and how they play a critical role in indicating mood, tone, scale, and the quality of your rendering. Stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for coming by. Have a great day.